The unchanging image. Photographs are supposed to be honest. They exist to preserve a single moment, a fragment of reality captured and frozen in time. A smile that will never fade, a room that will never change, a second that will never move forward or backward again. When we look at an old photograph, we don't expect surprises. We expect familiarity, certainty, proof that something once existed exactly the way we remember it. Because memory, as unreliable as it may be, still feels stable when it is anchored to an image. But what if the image itself could not be trusted? What if the moment you believed was fixed wasn't? The photograph in this story looked ordinary at first glance. It was slightly faded, its edges softened by age, the surface marked by tiny scratches that suggested decades of careless handling. The colors had washed into warm, muted tones, as if time itself had gently blurred the scene. Nothing about it demanded attention. Nothing about it warned of danger. It showed a modest living room, lit by pale afternoon light slipping through a dusty window. A small wooden table stood near the center of the room. A single chair rested beside it. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, revealing layers of forgotten years beneath. Every detail felt familiar, comforting, almost nostalgic. The kind of room that could belong to anyone, anywhere. A place you might have visited once in a dream and barely remembered afterward. At first, there was nothing wrong with the photograph. You could study it for minutes and see nothing unusual. No distortions, no hidden shapes, no unsettling shadows. Just a quiet, lifeless moment preserved exactly as it should be. And yet, there was a subtle feeling that lingered when you looked away. A faint sense that something had been interrupted. Not fear, not yet. More like the uncomfortable awareness that a sentence had been left unfinished. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and forget why you came there. Or when you're certain you placed an object somewhere, only to find it missing moments later. Your eyes return to the photograph, searching for confirmation, reassurance, proof that nothing has changed, and everything appears exactly the same. The chair is still there. The table remains in place. The light still rests gently on the floor. But deep inside, a quiet question begins to form. If you weren't looking, how would you know if the image stayed the same? Because memory is not static, and sometimes neither is the past. The discovery. The photograph was not supposed to matter. It was buried beneath stacks of forgotten objects at a weekend flea market on the edge of town, half hidden inside a warped cardboard box that smelled faintly of dust and rain. Old books with broken spines leaned against cracked picture frames. Rusted keys lay tangled in a jar. A broken clock rested face down, its hands frozen at an hour no one remembered. The photograph lay at the bottom, protected by nothing more than a thin sheet of yellowed paper. It didn't stand out. There were no dramatic faces, no dramatic lighting, no famous landmarks, just a quiet interior scene that felt strangely neutral, as if it had been carefully designed to attract no attention at all. A small living room, a wooden table, a single chair, a dusty window filtering pale afternoon light. The buyer almost didn't notice it. They were searching for nothing in particular, just wandering, killing time, letting their eyes drift across objects that once belonged to strangers. The photograph slipped into their hands without intention, lifted absent-mindedly like any other discarded memory. The paper felt thin and slightly brittle, its edges soft from years of handling. When tilted toward the light, faint scratches shimmered across the surface, catching the sun for a brief moment before fading again. Still, nothing seemed unusual. The buyer paid a few coins without bargaining and slipped the photograph into their bag, already half forgetting it existed. It wasn't until later that evening, in the quiet of their apartment, that the photograph returned to their attention. The room was dim, illuminated only by the warm glow of a desk lamp and the distant flicker of streetlights bleeding through the curtains. Outside, the city hummed softly. Distant traffic, muffled voices, the occasional echo of footsteps passing below. The buyer unpacked their bag, setting small purchases on the desk one by one. A chipped mug, an old paperback novel, a loose bundle of postcards, and finally, the photograph. They placed it upright against a stack of books and leaned back in their chair, letting their eyes settle on it properly for the first time. The image felt calm, almost peaceful. The living room inside the frame looked untouched, suspended in quiet stillness. The window allowed a thin ribbon of sunlight to stretch across the wooden floor. Dust particles hovered midair, frozen forever in the captured moment. The chair angled slightly toward the table, as if someone had just stood up and stepped away. There was something intimate about it. Not personal, but private. Like walking into a stranger's home when no one is there. The buyer studied the details slowly, tracing the faded lines of the wallpaper, the faint grain of the table's surface, the gentle curve of the chair's backrest. They tried to imagine who once lived there, what kind of life had unfolded in that silent room. Nothing came to mind. The photograph offered no clues. After a few minutes, their phone buzzed with a message, a notification, a distraction. They glanced away, only for a second. When their eyes returned to the photograph, something felt different. Not visibly wrong, not immediately obvious. Just a subtle tension beneath the surface of the image, like a word resting on the tip of the tongue, refusing to fully form. The buyer leaned forward, narrowing their eyes, scanning the scene carefully. Everything looked the same. The table was still centered. The window still filtered soft light. The chair still rested beside the table. And yet, a faint unease settled in their chest. They brushed it aside, blaming fatigue, imagination, the long day spent wandering through crowded stalls and noisy streets. The mind plays tricks when it is tired. Memory fills in gaps where certainty should exist. They turned away again, reaching for the paperback novel. A few minutes passed. When they looked back at the photograph, the feeling returned, stronger this time. The chair was closer to the table, not dramatically, not enough to scream alarm, just a few centimeters closer than before. The buyer froze. They stared at the image, their heartbeat subtly quickening, eyes locked onto the chair's position relative to a small scratch on the wooden floor visible in the photo. The alignment felt wrong, misplaced. They leaned closer, almost pressing their face toward the glass of the frame, searching for any rational explanation. Maybe the photograph had been slightly tilted earlier. Maybe the angle of light had changed their perception. Maybe their memory had simply failed them. The human brain is remarkably good at inventing certainty where none exists. They shook their head and exhaled slowly, forcing their shoulders to relax. "It didn't move," they muttered quietly to themselves. "It can't." To prove it, they pulled out their phone and snapped a quick picture of the photograph on the desk, just in case. They left the room to make tea. The kettle hummed softly in the kitchen, filling the silence with a familiar comfort. Steam fogged the window. A spoon clinked against ceramic. Normal sounds, normal reality. When they returned to the desk, mug in hand, they glanced automatically toward the photograph. The chair had shifted again. Another small adjustment, another impossible change. This time, there was no mistaking it. They grabbed their phone, hands slightly unsteady, and compared the live image in front of them with the photo they had taken minutes earlier. The difference was undeniable. The chair had moved closer to the table by a visible margin. A cold weight settled in their stomach. They stared back and forth between the two images, pulse growing louder in their ears. Logic scrambled for explanations. Reflections, lens distortion, accidental movement of the frame. But the photograph itself had not been touched. The desk was undisturbed. The frame was still upright. Nothing in the room had shifted, except the image inside the photograph. They stepped back slowly, as if the picture might react to their presence. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet, too still. They turned their gaze away deliberately, counting silently in their head. 1, 2, 3. When they looked again, the chair had not moved. Relief washed through them, brief and fragile. Maybe it had stopped. Maybe whatever had happened was over. They looked away once more, and when they looked back again, the chair was closer than it had ever been before, almost touching the table. The buyer felt a chill crawl up their spine. The photograph wasn't simply changing, it was responding to absence, to the moment when no one was watching. They slowly reached out and turned the photograph face down on the desk. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. Behind the cardboard backing and thin glass, something waited, something that only moved when it was unseen. The changes. The photograph stayed face down on the desk all night. The buyer told themselves it was only temporary, just long enough for their nerves to settle, just long enough for the strange tension in the room to fade. They brushed their teeth, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed, but sleep did not come easily. Every small sound felt amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant echo of a passing car, the soft tick of the wall clock measuring invisible seconds. Their eyes kept drifting toward the dark shape of the desk in the corner of the room, where the photograph rested unseen, pressed against the wooden surface like a secret. It felt wrong to leave it uncovered. It felt worse to look at it. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally overtook unease. The buyer drifted into shallow sleep, filled with restless images. Shifting rooms, moving shadows, the faint sensation of being watched without knowing from where. Morning light crept through the curtains, pale and uncertain. For several long seconds after waking, the memory of the photograph felt distant, like a dream dissolving at the edges. Then reality returned. The buyer sat up slowly, heart already tightening in anticipation. They crossed the room and stood over the desk, staring down at the back of the frame. A simple decision: turn it over or walk away. Curiosity won. They lifted the frame and flipped it face up. The image inside had changed again. Not just the chair this time. The sunlight entering through the window was different, longer, angled lower, casting deeper shadows across the floor. Dust particles that had once floated near the window were now scattered unevenly, as if disturbed by movement. The table's position had shifted slightly, its legs no longer aligned with the same cracks in the floorboards. Time had advanced. Not hours, not minutes, but enough to be noticeable. The buyer's breath caught in their throat. They raised their phone immediately and took another photograph, hands steady through force of will rather than comfort. Documentation had become instinct now, proof against denial, against memory's fragile distortions. They set the frame down and stared at it for a long moment, resisting the urge to blink. Nothing moved while they watched. The room inside the photograph remained perfectly still, as frozen as any ordinary image. Slowly, deliberately, they looked away. They turned their head toward the window, counting under their breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. When they looked back, the change was subtle but undeniable. The shadow beneath the table had shifted, stretching slightly farther across the floor. A quiet chill crept through their body. It wasn't imagination. It was behavior. The photograph was reacting to absence. The buyer spent the rest of the morning conducting careful, nervous experiments. They marked the photograph's position on the desk with small pieces of tape to ensure the frame itself wasn't moving. They kept their phone ready, capturing each version. They timed how long they looked away. They adjusted lighting in the room to rule out reflections and distortions. Every variable they could think of was controlled, and every result confirmed the same impossible truth. Whenever the photograph was unobserved, even for a second, something inside it changed. Not randomly, gradually, purposefully. The room inside the frame aged in tiny increments. Shadows crept forward. Objects shifted by fractions of distance. Dust patterns rearranged themselves as if brushed aside by invisible motion. The changes followed a consistent direction. Toward the camera, toward the viewer. It felt like watching time itself crawl forward through a keyhole. By midday, the buyer noticed something new. At the far edge of the image, near the doorway partially hidden by shadow, there was a darker patch that hadn't existed before. At first, it looked like nothing more than a deepened shadow, a trick of contrast where the light failed to reach. But it remained, and with each unobserved moment, it grew slightly more defined. The buyer zoomed in with their phone, comparing the latest image with earlier versions. The shape had structure, vertical lines, a curved outline, the suggestion of shoulders, a human silhouette. Their pulse quickened. The room inside the photograph was no longer empty. They watched the image carefully, breath shallow, afraid to look away but unable to stop blinking. The silhouette remained frozen whenever their eyes stayed on it, locked in place like a paused frame in a film. Only when their gaze slipped elsewhere did the figure advance. A fraction closer, a fraction clearer. The buyer tested it cautiously, glancing at the wall and back again. The figure shifted forward. They swallowed hard. It was standing just inside the doorway now, partially illuminated by the angled light from the window. Still no face, still no details, just the unmistakable presence of a person-shaped form occupying space where nothing had been before. Fear began to replace curiosity. This was no longer a harmless anomaly. This was a presence. The buyer backed away from the desk, heart pounding, the room suddenly feeling smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward. They considered throwing the photograph away, destroying it, locking it in a drawer. But something about the image exerted a quiet gravity, a pull that made it difficult to fully turn away from. They placed the photograph face down again, hands trembling slightly. For several hours they avoided it. They cleaned the apartment. They checked their phone, obsessively. They turned on the television just to fill the silence with noise. But the awareness of the photograph never left. It lingered like an unfinished sentence at the back of the mind. Eventually, unable to resist, they returned. Slowly, cautiously, they flipped the photograph over once more. The silhouette had moved closer. It now stood fully inside the room. The light revealed more of its outline, arms hanging at its sides, head tilted slightly downward, posture suggesting quiet intent rather than randomness. It felt as if the figure was aware of being observed. The buyer's mouth went dry. They took several quick photos for documentation, hands shaking more visibly now. They tried speaking aloud, half joking, half desperate. "This isn't real," they whispered. The room offered no response. The figure remained motionless while watched. The buyer looked away. When they looked back, the figure had advanced again, closer to the table, closer to the camera. Its outline sharpened. Edges became less blurred, more defined, as if resolution itself were increasing with proximity. Still no facial features. Just a growing certainty that this was no longer a passive image. This was movement with intention. By evening, the figure had crossed half the distance between the doorway and the table. The buyer could no longer pretend this was coincidence, illusion, or mechanical failure. Every test confirmed the same rule. Observation froze it. Absence allowed it to move. The realization carried a deep, instinctive dread. If it could move inside the photograph, what would happen when it reached the camera's position? What would happen when there was nowhere left for it to go inside the frame? The buyer sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photograph across the room. They felt trapped between two fears, looking at it and watching the figure exist, looking away and allowing it to advance. The photograph had become a quiet predator of attention, a paradox with teeth, and somewhere deep inside, beneath logic and denial, a terrible thought began to form. The photograph was not just changing, it was approaching. The approaching figure. The buyer stopped sleeping normally after that. Night became a shallow, fragile state, a series of half-awake hours broken by sudden jolts of consciousness, the mind constantly returning to the same image, the silhouette inside the photograph, standing quietly in a room that should never change. They kept the frame on the desk, facing the wall, not hidden, not destroyed, just turned away, as if denying its sight could somehow deny its existence. But even when unseen, it felt present, like a weight in the room, like an awareness pressing gently against the back of the mind. Every morning, the same ritual repeated itself. The buyer would stand several feet away from the desk, breathing slowly, preparing for what they might find. Their hand would hover over the frame for a long second before turning it around. Each time, the figure was closer, not dramatically closer, not enough to cause immediate panic, but enough to confirm a steady, unstoppable progression. The distance between the figure and the table continued to shrink. The shadows around its body sharpened, revealing clearer contours, the slope of shoulders, the angle of elbows, the curve of a neck. It was no longer an abstract shape. It was undeniably human. Still, the face remained hidden. Whenever the buyer tried to focus on the head, the lighting inside the photograph seemed to obscure it, either swallowed by shadow or washed out by glare, as if the image itself refused to reveal that final detail, or perhaps the figure refused. The buyer began timing how fast it moved. 1 second of looking away allowed a barely measurable shift. 5 seconds allowed a noticeable step forward. 10 seconds brought a change impossible to ignore. The movement was not jerky or distorted. It was smooth, natural, like a person walking through a room when no one was watching. The realization was deeply unsettling. This was not random animation. It followed rules. It respected physics. It occupied space correctly. The figure cast shadows consistent with the light. Its position aligned logically with the furniture. Perspective adjusted naturally as it moved closer to the camera inside the frame. Reality behaved properly inside the photograph, except for the impossible fact that it was happening at all. The buyer tried limiting how often they looked away. They forced themselves to stare at the photograph for long stretches, eyes burning, blinking minimized, body tense. Nothing moved while observed. The figure remained frozen mid-step, like a paused video frame. But the human body cannot stare forever. Eyes dry, vision blurs, attention drifts. Every involuntary blink became a risk. Every moment of distraction became a loss of control. The buyer began experiencing a creeping paranoia, not of the photograph itself, but of their own biology, their own need to blink, to breathe, to look elsewhere. The photograph was turning natural human limitations into vulnerabilities. Small mistakes accumulated. The buyer once dropped their phone while documenting the image. Their eyes instinctively followed the falling device. When they looked back, the figure had advanced significantly, close enough now that it stood near the edge of the table inside the photograph. The shock left their hands shaking. Another time, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. A delivery. They hesitated, torn between answering and protecting the fragile boundary of observation. They chose the door. When they returned, the figure had moved again, closer than ever. Now the figure's hands were visible, long fingers hanging loosely at its sides. The lighting revealed subtle texture in the silhouette, folds suggesting fabric, faint highlights tracing contours of limbs. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had depth, volume, presence. The buyer started avoiding distractions altogether. They unplugged the doorbell. They silenced their phone. They closed the curtains. The apartment became a controlled environment built around a single purpose: keep watching. But even vigilance had limits. Hunger pulled attention away. Fatigue slowed reaction time. The mind wandered despite effort, and the figure continued its patient advance. By the third day, it stood directly beside the table inside the photograph. The proximity made the image feel claustrophobic, as if the room inside the frame had shrunk. The buyer could see more detail now, the way the figure's shoulders subtly angled forward, the unnatural stillness of its posture when frozen mid-motion. It did not look relaxed. It looked intent, as if moving with quiet purpose rather than wandering. The buyer tried speaking to it again, voice barely steady. "Why are you moving?" they asked the empty room. The figure did not react, but the silence felt heavier afterward. They tried covering the photograph with cloth instead of turning it face down, hoping darkness might count as observation. It did not. When they lifted the cloth again, the figure had moved closer. Darkness counted as absence. So did closed eyes. So did camera lenses. The figure moved whenever it was not directly seen by human eyes. That rule became terrifyingly clear. The buyer tested using their phone's live camera feed to watch the photograph while looking away. For a brief hopeful moment it seemed to work. Then during one test they noticed movement on the screen itself. The figure advanced even while visible digitally. Only direct human observation stopped it. No reflection, no recording, no proxy, only eyes. The figure now stood between the table and the camera inside the photograph. Too close. Far too close. Its head remained angled slightly downward, face still hidden by an unnatural balance of light and shadow. The buyer felt a growing sense of personal violation, as if the photograph was no longer simply an object, but a window into a space that was actively encroaching on them. A boundary was thinning. Something was approaching the edge of containment. The buyer stopped leaving the apartment altogether. They slept in short bursts on the couch facing the desk, waking frequently to confirm the photograph hadn't been disturbed, hadn't moved while their eyes were closed. But sleep always claimed its debt eventually. Microsleep slipped through awareness, seconds of darkness behind eyelids. Each one cost distance. Each one brought the figure closer. By the end of the week, the figure filled most of the frame. Its torso dominated the foreground. The background room was now partially obscured by its presence. The sense of depth inside the photograph became overwhelming. the perspective distortion making the figure feel almost as if it might step out of the frame at any moment. Still, the face remained hidden, always just out of clarity, always denied. The buyer became afraid of the moment when the face would finally reveal itself, afraid of recognition, afraid of connection, because something about the posture, the proportions, the way the body occupied space felt uncomfortably familiar, not consciously recognizable, but intuitively wrong, like seeing your own reflection move half a second too late. The buyer's reflection in the glass of the frame occasionally overlapped the silhouette inside the image, two human shapes aligning, one real, one not. The visual overlap made their stomach twist. The idea formed slowly, reluctantly, like a truth the mind resisted accepting. The figure was not just approaching the camera, it was approaching the observer, not metaphorically, not symbolically, spatially. Whatever existed inside the photograph was closing distance between worlds. The buyer began experiencing brief moments of dissociation, standing in the room but feeling slightly detached from their own body, as if their sense of position was subtly unstable. Depth perception occasionally felt off. The edges of furniture sometimes seemed to blur momentarily, like poorly rendered scenery. They wondered, in quiet terror, whether the photograph was doing more than changing itself, whether it was altering perception, memory, reality. The figure reached the very edge of the photograph. One more step would place it directly against the invisible barrier separating image from observer. The buyer stood frozen, eyes locked onto the frame, afraid to blink. Their eyes burned. Tears formed. Muscles trembled from tension. But they did not look away. They could not. Because somewhere in the deepest part of their mind, a single question echoed endlessly. If it reaches the camera, what does that mean for what exists outside the frame? Memory and observation. Something subtle began to change, not inside the photograph, but inside the buyer. At first, they noticed it in small, almost dismissible ways. They would enter a room and pause, unsure why they had gone there. They would reread the same sentence in a book without retaining its meaning. They would lose track of time, convinced only minutes had passed when the clock insisted otherwise. Fatigue, they told themselves. Stress, lack of sleep. Normal explanations for an abnormal situation. But the pattern grew harder to ignore. Their memories felt softer, not erased, not missing, just slightly unstable, like an image that had been copied too many times and lost sharpness with each reproduction. The buyer began keeping notes, small reminders written on sticky pads and scattered around the apartment. Turn the photograph face down before sleeping. Document every change. Do not look away for too long. At first, the notes helped. Then one morning, they found a new note on the desk, written in their own handwriting, that they did not remember writing. You already checked it. The message sent a cold ripple through their chest. Checked what? The photograph? They stood frozen for several seconds, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into clarity. Nothing came back. No memory of writing the note. No memory of what had been checked. Only the uneasy certainty that the handwriting was unmistakably theirs. From that moment on, doubt began creeping into everything they trusted. They started questioning their own recollections of the photograph's progression. Had the figure always moved this fast? Had it always been this close? Had they missed something important days ago and simply forgotten? They relied increasingly on their phone's images to anchor reality, scrolling through dozens of documented versions of the photograph, reassuring themselves that the changes were real, measurable, consistent. Yet even those records began to feel strangely distant, as if they were viewing someone else's memories rather than their own. The buyer began experiencing brief lapses in continuity, moments where they would suddenly become aware of standing in a different position than they remembered, holding an object they didn't recall picking up, sitting on the couch without remembering walking there. The gaps were never large, seconds, maybe minutes, but the absence itself was disturbing. The mind hates blank spaces. It tries to fill them, sometimes incorrectly. They wondered, quietly, fearfully, whether the photograph was not only responding to observation, but feeding on it. Every moment of attention froze the figure in place. Every moment of inattention allowed it to advance. Observation had power, but perhaps it also had a cost. What if every second spent watching the photograph was being recorded somewhere else, not in the image, but in the observer? What if memory itself was the exchange? The buyer began to feel as though their own recollections were being slowly overwritten, replaced by something slightly misaligned with reality. They tried recalling childhood memories, familiar places, old friends, small personal details that once felt solid and unquestionable. Some came easily, others felt strangely vague. Faces blurred in the mind's eye, names lingered just out of reach. Events lost emotional weight like faded photographs. It terrified them more than the moving image ever had, because the photograph threatened the body, but memory threatened identity. Who were you without reliable memory? Who were you if your past could quietly rearrange itself without your permission? They noticed that when they stared at the photograph for extended periods, their sense of self felt slightly thinner, as if part of their attention was being pulled inward toward the image, leaving the rest of their mind under-anchored. They would occasionally catch their reflection in the glass covering the photograph and experience a fleeting sense of unfamiliarity, a half-second delay before recognizing their own face. The disconnect was subtle, but deeply unsettling. The buyer experimented carefully. They tried deliberately not thinking about the photograph for several hours, distracting themselves with music, cleaning, television. During those periods, the sense of mental fog lifted slightly. Their thoughts felt clearer, memory sharpened, time felt more continuous. But when they returned to the photograph and resumed observation, the mental strain returned almost immediately. A pressure behind the eyes, a faint buzzing in the back of the skull. A sense of being watched, not by the figure inside the image, but by something abstract and impersonal, like a system monitoring input. Observation was not neutral, it was participation. The buyer began to suspect that the photograph was not merely changing when unobserved. It was stabilizing itself when observed, as if reality inside the image required external attention to remain fixed, and attention in turn required memory to anchor it, a closed loop. Observer sustains image, image alters observer, neither remains unchanged. The figure inside the photograph stood now impossibly close to the camera, frozen at the boundary, unable to cross while being watched. A stalemate, a balance maintained only through constant vigilance, but vigilance demanded energy, focus, mental integrity, and the buyer's mind was already showing signs of erosion. They wondered what would happen if their memory degraded enough that they could no longer remember to keep watching. What if one day they simply forgot why the photograph mattered? What if they forgot that looking away was dangerous? The thought chilled them more than the idea of the figure crossing the boundary, because forgetting would mean surrender without realizing it. The buyer began setting alarms, hourly reminders labeled with blunt urgency. Look at the photograph. Do not look away too long. Even so, the alarms sometimes startled them as if they had no recollection of setting them. The boundary between intention and action felt increasingly fragile. At times, the buyer questioned whether they were still fully in control of their own attention, or whether something else was subtly guiding where their mind drifted. Memory was not static. It was an active process, a reconstruction, a fragile agreement between perception and belief. And the photograph seemed to be exploiting that weakness, not attacking directly, not violently, but patiently, incrementally, like erosion shaping stone. The buyer realized something deeply unsettling. The photograph did not need to force its way out. It only needed to wait until the observer could no longer reliably observe, until memory weakened enough to fail, until identity blurred enough to slip. Observation kept the figure contained, but memory kept observation possible, and both were slowly being worn down. The buyer stood in the dim apartment, eyes fixed on the frozen image, mind strained by constant alertness, heart beating quietly in the silence. They were not simply watching a photograph anymore. They were guarding the stability of their own mind, and they could feel, with growing certainty, that the balance could not last forever. The final change. The buyer did not remember falling asleep. One moment, they were sitting upright on the couch, eyes fixed on the photograph across the room, fighting the familiar burning ache behind their eyelids. The next moment, morning light spilled softly through the curtains. Their neck was stiff, their throat dry, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Panic surged instantly. They searched the desk. The photograph was face up. Their heart slammed violently against their ribs. They did not remember turning it over. They did not remember looking away. They did not remember closing their eyes. For a long frozen second, they could not bring themselves to look directly at the image. Fear rooted them in place, because they already knew something was wrong. Slowly, reluctantly, they lifted their gaze. The room inside the photograph was gone. No table, no chair, no window, no familiar walls. The image was now filled entirely by a human face. Close, too close. So close that perspective felt wrong, as if the lens had been pressed directly against skin. It was their face. Every detail was unmistakable. The curve of the cheekbone, the faint scar near the eyebrow, the slight asymmetry of the lips, the exact pattern of eyelashes. The expression was neutral, not angry, not afraid, not alive, just empty, like a mirror that reflected without recognition. A cold numbness spread through their body, replacing panic with disbelief. Their mind rejected the image instinctively. This cannot be real. This cannot be happening. They stepped closer, drawn by a terrible curiosity, studying the image as if proximity might somehow rewrite reality. The face in the photograph did not move, did not blink, did not breathe. It was frozen in perfect, impossible stillness. The buyer lifted a trembling hand and touched their own cheek, warm, alive, real. Yet the photograph offered no comfort, because recognition cut both ways. If the image was their face, then what had been approaching inside the photograph, and where had it gone? A sickening realization crept into their thoughts. The figure had not escaped the photograph. It had arrived at its destination. The boundary had not broken outward. It had folded inward. Memory fragments surfaced, moments of mental fog, forgotten actions, unexplained notes, time gaps, subtle exchanges, tiny losses. The photograph had not needed to replace the body. It had only needed access to the self. The buyer felt a strange disconnect from their reflection in the glass covering the frame, as if the face staring back was both familiar and slightly misaligned, like a delayed echo. They raised their hand. The reflection raised its hand, but the timing felt wrong, off by a fraction of a second, enough to trigger a deep, instinctive alarm. They stepped back abruptly, heart pounding. The room around them felt subtly unfamiliar. The angle slightly wrong, the depth slightly flattened, as if the environment had lost a small degree of dimensionality. Their own hands looked strangely distant, like objects rather than extensions of self. A terrifying question surfaced. Which side of the photograph was real? The buyer staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the desk for stability. Memories no longer felt securely anchored. Past events blurred together. The flea market, the first chair movement, the silhouette, the endless watching. They could recall them, but the emotional connection felt muted, like remembering someone else's story. Ownership of memory was slipping. They noticed something else. The photograph's surface no longer reflected the room accurately. The reflection lagged, not physically, perceptually, as if the glass existed in a slightly different temporal layer. They leaned closer. The eyes in the photograph seemed almost aware, not moving, not reacting, but holding a strange depth that the frozen image should not possess, like something was now looking out from behind their own face. The buyer stumbled backward. A sudden wave of vertigo washed over them, accompanied by the sensation of falling inward rather than outward. The room tilted, sound dulled, the edges of vision darkened slightly. For a terrifying moment, they felt as if they were not entirely located inside their body anymore, as if their point of view was unstable, drifting. They closed their eyes tightly and took several deep breaths, grounding themselves in physical sensation, the texture of the carpet beneath their feet, the weight of air filling their lungs, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. Slowly, the dizziness eased. They opened their eyes. The photograph still showed their face, unchanged, unblinking, unforgiving. A quiet horror settled into their chest. This was not a dramatic ending. No violent rupture, no monster emerging into the room. Just a subtle, irreversible shift, a replacement of perspective. The buyer understood with sinking clarity that something fundamental had already crossed over. Not in space, in identity. They were still themselves, mostly, but not entirely. The gaps in memory would widen. The sense of detachment would grow. The alignment between self and body would slowly drift. And one day, perhaps soon, they might look into a mirror and no longer feel recognition at all. The photograph would not need to move anymore. It had completed its change. The buyer gently turned the frame face down, not out of fear this time, but out of instinctive denial, as if hiding the image could hide the truth. They stepped away from the desk and stood in the center of the apartment, listening to their own breathing, feeling the fragile continuity of awareness holding itself together moment by moment. Outside, the world continued normally. Cars passed, voices echoed faintly, sunlight traced predictable paths across buildings. Reality showed no sign that anything extraordinary had occurred, but inside the buyer, something irreversible had shifted. They could feel it, like a quiet misalignment between thought and presence, between memory and ownership, between who they were and who was now watching from the other side of their own face. What does it mean? What if the photograph was never the threat? What if it was only a mirror, a tool that revealed something already fragile inside the human mind? We trust memory as if it were a permanent archive, a stable record of who we are, where we have been, what we have experienced. But neuroscience tells us that memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Every time we remember something, we rebuild it slightly differently. Small details shift, emotions fade or sharpen. The past quietly reshapes itself. If memory is constantly changing, then identity is never truly fixed. The photograph did not break reality. It exposed its flexibility. Observation gives meaning to what we perceive. When we look at something, we stabilize it in our awareness. We define its shape, its position, its boundaries. But when we stop looking, the mind fills the gaps with assumptions, habits, expectations. The photograph exploited that blind space, not by force, not by violence, but by patience. It moved only when unobserved, just as memories drift when we stop paying attention to them. Over time, small distortions accumulate. A chair shifts, a shadow stretches, a face replaces a room. Perhaps the approaching figure was not an intruder at all. Perhaps it was the observer's own identity slowly reorganizing itself. A reminder that the self we believe in is not a solid object, but a process, constantly updated by attention, memory, and perception. If you stop observing who you are, who decides what you become? The final image, a face replacing the room, may symbolize the collapse of boundaries between observer and observed. The moment when perception turns inward and identity becomes uncertain. Or perhaps the photograph was something darker, a system that requires awareness to remain stable, a parasite that feeds on attention and memory. A silent intelligence that understands human limits and waits patiently for them to fail. The truth may not matter as much as the implication, because every human being lives inside the same fragile loop. We observe, we remember, we forget, we change, and most of the time we never notice the shift happening. So the real question is not what the photograph meant. The real question is this: if something only moves when you are not looking, how much of your own life is quietly changing in the moments you don't notice? And when you finally look back, will you still recognize what you see?
Shadows grow where the light won't go. A silent wind, it starts to grow.